We're on. This is the second time I've done the introduction because there was a little bit of a technical difficulty, which we're overcoming as we speak, and people should be joining us forthwith. So, for people that are joining us for the first time, what we are doing is going through the 10 words, the 10 commandments, not just in Exodus chapter 20 and Deuteronomy chapter 5, which do have their differences, by the way,
Yep.
but in even more ancient copies than the copies that we have. The copies that we have, of course, come from the Leningrad Codex primarily. There's Peggy, there's Mark, and
Okay, thanks for. I think Seth is shooting them the link. Maybe
Christo.
that's what's going on.
There's everyone. What was I saying? Oh, not just in those copies, which date back to a copy made in about 1,000 years ago, anyhow.
Right.
And we're going all the way back to the Nash Papyrus. We're going to the All Souls Deuteronomy in Qumran, right? The Samaritan Pentateuch, and of course the Shapiro scroll, the Moses scroll. And g'day, Karen. And that is what we're doing, and we're going through each of the 10 words, comparing them to see if there are any differences. Of course, there are some differences.
There are,
which is remarkable. What are those differences? Some of them are very significant. Some of them are small, but it's definitely worth having a look at. Before I go any further, and as I was explaining to Ross before, when we thought we were live and we weren't, is that
we may have been, but it was somehow in a glitch. I made a mistake on scheduling, and
we were lost in the matrix.
I'll get it back. I'll get right. Okay, all right. So anyway,
Dave,
there you are. You're greeting everyone.
Dave, I'm greeting everybody. G'day, Stephen. Dave says hello. I was on the wrong broadcast, and we were too, Dave. We were lost in some sort of vortex, but we're all together now. And there's Eric. And the reason why I'm saying g'day to everybody, as I usually do, is because I love to see, like so many of you guys I know.
Yep.
A lot of you have been on the Tanakh tour. We're going to talk about that in a minute. But g'day, Lynn. Lynn's coming on the Tanakh tour. Lynn and Tiffany.
That's right.
And Pam. But we love to see you guys. We love your comments, and we love you saying g'day and all that sort of stuff. But somebody said, "Hey, can you just be a little bit more of a professional and serious because you sound like Romper Room?" And I said to Ross, "Have you ever heard of Romper Room?" And it's news to you, but I just looked it up while we were fixing this glitch, and I will read this from the wiki. Romper Room, Ross, is an American children's television series that was franchised and syndicated from 1953 to 1994, targeted at preschoolers. And that's, when I was a preschooler, I used to watch it here in Australia because it was franchised internationally in Canada, United Kingdom, Japan, Finland.
So this is a big deal then.
It's a big deal. New Zealand, Puerto Rico, Paraguay, Argentina, and of course Australia. It was a big deal. I enjoyed it, and I know like preschoolers loved it. Oh, look, see, Marlene was actually first in the Vortex. Somehow she found us in the Vortex.
Yeah.
But she watched Romper Room. Dave saw it all the time. Oh, there you go. See,
maybe it's just me. But anyway,
I got to tell you the story about Romper Room. Hold on.
All right.
I think it was Miss Helena. Was it Miss Helena everywhere? Was that a franchise name, everyone? I don't know. Pam watched it. In any case, in Australia, I think it was Miss Helena. And she would look into the camera, right? And she would start saying, I can see Dave, and I can see Lynn, and I can see, and she'd say all these children's names, right? And she'd be looking into the camera, and my God, if she said your name, she'd be looking at you through the TV, and we all thought that was a real thing, right?
Right.
And you'd be hanging there going, "See me, say my name," it was a big deal. And of course, that's what we're doing now, and that's what someone I don't know who it was who left a comment said. You guys,
be serious.
Be serious. Stop having fun. You sound like Romper Room. Of course, we do sound like Romper Room, but we actually do see you because you're leaving these. The magic mirror, Lynn. That's right. There was the magic mirror. Takes me back. Anyway.
Look, Christo reminds me. I hate to pull us out of the Romper Room because I'm just now getting into this. But Christo says it's approximately 100-ish days until I land in Cairo, trying to get a better plane itinerary for the end of October. So
you know what, Christo, you've got to get those dates because you want a couple of extra days at the end. We're staying at the Prima Royale at the end. Lynn and Tiffany, myself. I'm gonna stick around a couple of days, I think. And so we'll do a bunch of stuff together after the tour. You can't do everything in Jerusalem in just a few days. Really, you can't do everything in Jerusalem in probably a few months. But so there's no end to stuff that we can go and see and do while we're there if we're going to stick around for a couple of extra days.
Yep.
So
And really the only end of this, for at least for Americans, is I believe that it's coming up on towards the end. You have to get home if you do Thanksgiving.
Yeah.
And so the tour ends up a few days before Thanksgiving, but a lot of people are going to want to get back to the States before Thanksgiving. So that's the only thing that might, make you leave early.
Yeah, so we leave a few days to make sure that if you want to be back by then you can get out of there quick, smart. Christo, you got your tickets. That's great. So send me, email me the details, and I'll adjust your invoice. So yeah, no, it'll be good, Lynn. There's all sorts of stuff that we can do. That like I said, we can't fit everything into the tour, and so the 20th will be doing all sorts of stuff, and I'm sure the weather will be beautiful as it always is that time of year. That is the Tanakh Tour. So for people that don't know anything about the Tanakh Tour, good heavens, TanakhTours.com, TANAKH, TanakhTours.com is the website. And the Tanakh Tour, the ultimate Tanakh Tour this year, Ross, there it is. Look at that going across the screen, is 2 legs. One is the Egypt Jordan Tour, and the second that follows back to back, of course, is Israel. And we are, you can do both, or you can do one or the other. And if you do both, you will get a $100 combination discount. So that, oh, by the way, boys and girls, so we have, boys and girls, I sound like Romper Room again.
You're going to get us in trouble.
There's going to be, there's only very limited room left on the Egypt Jordan Tour. So if you're thinking of coming, if you're intending to join us, get your deposit down quick, smart, because we really are now searching for extra rooms, and we're nailing that one down. There's a little bit more room on Israel, but for Egypt and Jordan, you really want to get your deposits down real fast to make sure that you are a part of that one. You did email Christo. Okay, good stuff. I'll check that out later on. All right, now Ross, what's going through your mind?
Well, I tell you, but before we dive into this is one of those that's fairly straightforward. One of those that's fairly straightforward. Like we've done a couple of these that aren't quite as detailed, but nonetheless, I do want to invite people to the class this coming Saturday. I just want to mention it because I'm not even going to let it out yet, all the details about it. But the world right now is entering into the Torah-oriented world, is jumping into Deuteronomy. And I love Deuteronomy. I'm not going to necessarily jump into the entire sequence of Torah portions, but I am going to. It's going to be interesting because my class this coming Saturday does at least touch on that first Torah portion, Devarim. But it's going to be quite a bit different, so people have to stay in tune and watch very closely.
So listen, just for people who haven't had a chance to catch up like myself, I haven't seen last week's class. What was that again?
Last week was on the heart, matters of the heart, and it was, I think it was well received, so people can check that one out. And let's see, I can post the link, but I'll post that later. But definitely, people need to be here this coming Saturday because 10:30 on this channel.
On this channel.
Yeah.
There you go. Karen's just saying I wasn't allowed to watch TV until 1989, so there was a gap in my Trivial Pursuit knowledge. What did you do that you were grounded until 1989? My goodness.
Yeah, the class this Saturday, Jono, was the Biblical King of Hearts. I missed the title.
Oh, that's right.
Biblical King of Hearts. Yeah.
All right.
Hey.
Good.
All right. So tonight we did a little bit of an intro, but it is sort of straightforward. Let me pull up. You always love this graph. Let me pull up this graph.
I do like it.
And people might be able to jump in and ask a few questions.
Yeah, so this is great what you're doing. Okay, so the first one, of course, is Exodus, Deuteronomy as we know it. Exodus SP and Deuteronomy SP is the Samaritan Pentateuch. The All Souls Deuteronomy is the one found at Qumran. Nash Papyrus in Egypt, and of course the Moses Scroll, the Shapiro Scroll, and we have some significant differences there. Yellow and red, take us through it.
Yeah,
Ross.
so the main thing I want to point out, if you start on the left and work your way across, you're going to see actually two documents. I'm not counting Shapiro yet. We'll get to that. But you'll see the Exodus of the Masoretic text and the Exodus of the Samaritan Pentateuch have sheker, which is the word translated generally as lie or falsehood. You'll notice that that word is different in the Deuteronomy of the Masoretic text, the Samaritan Pentateuch Deuteronomy, the All Souls Deuteronomy, and the Nash Papyrus. Notice that all of those have the word, now it's a related word, by the way. It's Shin Vav Aleph. So now remember the one that we did last week when we talked about covet. A couple of weeks ago, we showed that some of these actually mix this use of this word, whether sheker or this other Hebrew word. I'm going to pull this off the screen now, and we're going to read some English for people. So let's read the commandment as it sits in the Masoretic text in Exodus chapter 20 and in Deuteronomy chapter 5. How about that? Which one are you going to do?
Let's kick off. Well, I'll go 20 verse 13, is it? Is that right?
That's right. That's right.
Okay, so it says, it's so simple, isn't it? And this is in 13, of course, we have you shall not murder, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not steal. And then here, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse
17.
There you go.
Yeah. And it, like Exodus, has several in one verse. You shall not murder, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not steal. That's the big three, by the way. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. Now, the note, you and I both use and like the Jewish Study Bible.
We do.
The Jewish Study Bible, the note in Exodus 20 and verse 13 says the following. Under you shall not bear false witness. This covers both false accusation and false testimony in court. False accusation is a means of depriving one's fellow of what belongs to him, as when the accuser falsely claims ownership of something in another's possession and the accused cannot disprove it. And it gives a footnote, a reference to chapter 22, verse 8. The penalty for false testimony is described in Deuteronomy 19, verses 16 through 21. Now, before
we're going to go there in a minute.
Yeah, we need to go there. Before we go there, I want to ask you, do you think about, particularly the way that this definition was given in this footnote, do you think once again we're dealing with something to do with another's property or depriving someone? How did it word it? It's depriving one's fellow of what belongs to him. Think about that. I've wondered about that connection.
Giving a false testimony of an individual may be seen as defaming them, which is robbing them of their reputation, I suppose.
Right.
I think that's probably fair to say. Do you think?
Yeah, I think so. And it certainly is interesting that it references Deuteronomy 19. So let's go ahead and look at that. So first of all, Exodus 20, Deuteronomy 5, both of those are fairly straightforward. They read basically the same. We will look at Shapiro just a minute, but let's look at Deuteronomy 19.
Well, actually, before we do Deuteronomy 19:18, let's go back to Shapiro because it's related.
All right.
As we just pointed out, reading in Exodus and Deuteronomy, it says you shall not give a false testimony against your neighbor. Okay, which is interesting. And in the Shapiro text, if you bring it up there, and I'm guessing that you have this in red.
Let me see. I think I do. Here we go.
All right, tell us what we have here.
Okay. Slightly different spelling in the first phrase. It's you shall not respond, basically. Slightly different spelling, and that's a grammatical point that was debated long and hard in the 19th century. The next piece of red here is against your brother. Instead of saying neighbor, you'll see the word ach, the aleph and the chet. So this is every other ancient witness from the Nash Papyrus, All Souls, Exodus and Deuteronomy and the Samaritan, Exodus and Deuteronomy and the Masoretic, all have your neighbor, whereas here in Shapiro it says your brother. And then the other interesting things about Shapiro, one is instead of the ayin dalet, which is translated as a witness, as a false witness or a lying witness, this is debated as well because it's a different word, a dut. And so the question becomes, what exactly is this saying? We might be able to look at that in a moment. I have pulled out Dershowitz's commentary, which is a little more in depth.
Oh,
But
grand. Okay.
one more point.
Yeah.
Notice here, Shapiro's manuscript agrees with the Exodus versions, the Masoretic and the Samaritan, in that it uses sheker as opposed to what the verb shin vav aleph used by the others.
And that's curious, isn't it? I find that curious because, of course, Deuteronomy seems to use the Moses scroll as the platform from which it broadens,
Yeah.
But in just a couple of cases, the Moses scroll does concur, or rather, Exodus concurs with the Moses scroll more specifically, whereas it's been seemingly altered in Deuteronomy. This seems to be one of those cases. It's just a little bit curious, and I wonder why that is.
Yeah.
Nevertheless, with brother, this is the reason why I wanted you to read that out. So the cross-reference that you were reading, the study notes in this particular commandment takes us to Deuteronomy chapter 19, and I think it is 18. Yes.
Okay.
So verse 18 says, and the magistrate shall make a thorough investigation. If the man who testified is a false witness, if he has testified falsely against his fellow, and it goes on, you shall do to him as he schemed to do to his fellow. So what did that... It referenced that as it's something like retributive justice. Anyway, that's another discussion altogether.
Yeah.
But we come back to verse 18. If he has testified falsely against his fellow. So in the Hebrew, Ross, the question is, what is the word used for fellow? Is it neighbor? Is it associate? Is it brother?
In Deuteronomy 19:18, it actually is brother. Yeah.
So it's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because it's seemingly referencing the Torah, going back to this particular commandment, but here it uses brother. Whereas in Deuteronomy, referencing the 10 words, it uses neighbor. But in the Shapiro scroll, in the Moses scroll, it references brother. So it's neither here nor there, but it's worth highlighting, I think.
Well, let me ask a question. So I see Miriam has a comment here. There's no word for neighbor in the Hebrew. I don't know what that means. I don't know what she means by that because Re'echa, your neighbor, is clearly in all of the other translations. So let me just pull that back up just so you can see what I'm talking about. Now, if the point is that that this word does not mean neighbor, then that's a whole other discussion. But the word that is typically translated as neighbor is evident in every one of these ancient versions, with the exception of Shapiro. Shapiro uses brother, and so that's our point here.
Yeah.
All right.
And I think we commented last week that word may mean a next door neighbor, but it doesn't have to. The context usually dictates, and it can mean just someone with whom you have a closer relationship with.
That's right.
And I think I referenced Job, where he says, "I've become a neighbor to ostriches." He's an outcast, and these are his companions. I think is a companion to ostriches, and the word is neighbor there. Lynn says it's fellow in Fox's translation too. Everett Fox's, what's that one called?
Yeah, Everett Fox is also a really good one. Yeah.
Mm, that's good. And Christo, the Koran says neighbor. Yeah. So there you go.
Yeah, well, just Miriam, I see your Hebrew here. It's like it's okay. So you see the third, obviously you know Hebrew, but lotane, and then it has the word for against your neighbor, re'echa, bere'echa, ad sheker. So at least in term now, you just have to let me know if you're not translating re'echa as your neighbor, but it is in there. So that's our point. But to your point, Jono, so that opens up the question of who is your neighbor in Leviticus 19, which we've seen corresponding with Shapiro's manuscript quite a few times during this study. Does have some interesting things on that. You know, it's you shall love your neighbor as yourself and so forth. So it depends on whether you go wide or you go narrow with your definition of neighbor. Okay. So it depends. So I see Miriam's point is, does it not mean friend? And it depends on the translation, but I've seen it translated as both.
Yeah,
Now,
and the context in which it's okay. It may be of interest just talking about the Shapiro while I'm here because it always tends to add some definition. The curses, the blessings and the curses that correspond to this particular commandment. And in this case, the blessing is, blessed is the man who does not deal falsely and does not practice deceit with his neighbor. So it says brother in the commandment, it says neighbor in the blessing. All the people shall respond and say amen. The curse is, let's see, it is, cursed is the one who takes a bribe to testify deceitfully against his associate. Now that's interesting because associate is, I think that's the only time it's used in the Shapiro scroll, and
it
maybe
is.
I don't know if it's used a great deal in the Tanakh. It does actually. You've got a note here. And your note says the word translated as associate is the Hebrew amit. Is that right?
Yeah, that's
It
right.
occurs in 10 passages in the Hebrew Bible. 9 of these are in the book of Leviticus. And one appear. I wonder if. Oh, look, 19:18. Of course, chapter 19 of Leviticus is another attempt to recall the 10 words. And one appears in Zechariah chapter 3, verse 7. The word means associate, fellow, or relations. That's a curious little piece of information too.
Yeah.
Ross.
Yeah. So one of the things that I have in my notes, Jonah, we'll go through. It is pretty straightforward, but I have a couple of passages which translate this that we translate as false witness 9 times in the Hebrew Bible. And so obviously Deuteronomy 19 we already did. How about Psalm 27 verse 12? Psalm 27 verse 12. And that says, do not turn me over to the desire of my enemies, for false witnesses have risen against me, and the violent witness. So, verse 12, the violent witness. A day sheker, it's plural. The false witnesses have risen against me. Look at Proverbs. Let's do one more here at least. Proverbs chapter 6, verse 16. Notice that these are 6 things that the Lord hates, 7 that are an abomination to him: haughty eyes, a lying tongue, hands that shed innocent blood. Let's see, a heart that devises wicked plans, feet that run rapidly to do bad, Jono, and get this, a false witness who declares lies, one who spreads strife among the brothers. So this command
Among the brothers.
in the 10 words, don't be a false witness, or don't be don't raise a false testimony against your neighbor, your brother. that's one of the things listed in Proverbs 6 as something that God hates.
Can I interrupt you for a second?
Yeah, man.
Because now my mind is focused on, because you referenced as one of the cross references for associate is Leviticus chapter 19, verse 11. And as I mentioned, Leviticus chapter 19 is another attempt to recall the 10 words. So I went there, and this is fascinating to me because it's actually saying, and I want you to double check this for me. Can you look that up in the Hebrew? You shall not steal, you shall not deal deceitfully or falsely.
What verse? I'm sorry, Leviticus
Verse
what?
11, 19:11.
Okay.
You shall not deal deceitfully or falsely with one another. So the idea of deceit or falsehood and is with one another associate?
Yes. Yeah.
Well, that is
It's
fascinating.
that is fascinating. Yeah, it's below, and then so it's you shall not. The word is sheker there. You shall not lie or deal falsely, I guess. A man against his amit, which is the
Amit.
word that's used. So in that verse, I'm glad you found that one in Leviticus 19:11. I don't know if there's another passage that has both sheker dealing with a man and his associate
Yeah.
amit there.
So that's another remarkable similarity that we find with the Moses Scroll, and in this case, specific to the corresponding curse of this particular word. And I'll read it again. Cursed is the one who takes a bribe to testify against his associate. That is the word amit. So we find the theme and the victim of this particular crime in Leviticus 19, verse 11. And as we've often said, there are remarkable similarities between the Moses Scroll and Leviticus 19.
Yeah.
Fascinating. All right.
Well, we're really talking about truth and lying here. That's really what it comes down to. And I think that it's important to recognize how important this is to God. Again, we've already said it's one of the 6 things that God hates. And then look at this, Proverbs 12:17.
Mm-hmm.
One who declares truth tells what is right. Right in Hebrew, it's zedek, who
Mm-hmm.
speaks righteousness, basically. But the one who spreads a false witness deals in deceit.
Mm-hmm.
It's a different word than lying, even, but it's crooked. It's somebody who doesn't speak upright and who doesn't deal truthfully in righteousness is deceiving people.
Mm.
Let's see. I've got a couple more, Jonah. We might as well hit them. We have a few minutes, and
May as well. Lynn just asked, so she said defraud or lie to each other. How is it translated in the JPS? Well, the JPS, let me just again, it says, you shall not deal deceitfully or falsely. Yeah, to defraud or lie. Yep, fair enough.
Proverbs is big on this, Jono.
Oh, yeah?
A trustworthy, this is Proverbs 14:5. A trustworthy witness, and in fact, the word for witness is aid imunim. I talked to a friend of ours, Eric Nagel, who's online with us today. I talked with him this week, and he
Mm-hmm.
talked about emunai. He mentioned that word. A lot of people know this phrase. So a witness who's trustworthy will not lie, but a false witness declares lies.
Mm-hmm.
So it really comes down to people can debate, what does this mean? You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. There is an element where people might say it has to do with court.
Mm-hmm.
It's like you should speak honorably and truthfully in court. But a lot of these passages reveal that the ancient idea is don't lie against your neighbor. Don't tell something that is not true. How many times have people's reputation been ruined or their outlook has been devastated because someone lied?
Mm-hmm.
I'm reminded of the quote, and I don't know, it's been attributed to so many people. It's one of those when you look it up, who said it first.
Yeah, go.
But a lie will travel so
Oh,
fast
yeah.
that I think the phrase is, it'll
Before the
get
truth
around the
has a
world
chance to get
before
its boots
truth
on.
gets its boots on. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's true. That's
Yeah, it
true.
is.
Untruth spreads so fast.
Mm.
One more, Jono. I want to pick this. Look at.
Let me add to what you just
Go
said.
ahead.
It's interesting because years ago I used to be in sales, and we were often reminded that a bad report will spread faster at a rate of 10 to 1, I think, than a good report. And regardless of whether there's truth to it or not, if someone has a bad report, it's more likely to be repeated. So they would always tell us, make sure you do the best you can, cover all the bases, because you want to get that good report.
Yep. Like
Yeah.
Patty says, a false testimony can ruin someone's life irreparably.
Yeah.
And that's the thing. It's like you just can't survive sometimes in this. One point, just to show you how the writer of Proverbs puts it in chapter 25, verse 18, says, like a club, a sword, and a sharp arrow is a person who gives false testimony against his neighbor. And there, by the way, the word re'eh is used again. So we're translating that as neighbor. So the idea is really, when you think about these 10 words, I mean, they really are quite fascinating. And we keep seeing how Shapiro adds interesting elements to our discussion, because it does seem to represent a version from which others' memories come forward in later revisions. I think this is an earlier version, and that's what's so interesting. So Miriam is really hammering what is a neighbor, and
Right.
I'm with you. So that's a question, and I know a lot of people have asked this question. So what?
I'm gonna repeat the answer that I gave last week, if I can just find the details. Where did I write this? Okay. And this is when we were talking about, you shall not steal the property of your brother. The corresponding blessing states, blessed is the man who does not wrong his neighbor. The corresponding curse states, cursed is the one who moves his neighbor's land boundary. Leviticus 19:30 states, you shall not oppress your neighbor or rob him, so on and so forth. So I had, so the word, this is the word wrong. Where is the details on neighbor? I had this here somewhere.
Dig it up, Jono.
I'm digging.
All right, I'm going to pull
digging.
I'm going to pull this up because I might be missing Miriam's point. But, obviously the question becomes, I don't know if this is a matter of semantics. I don't know if she's saying, well, I wouldn't say neighbor, I would say a fellow or something of that nature. Because there is the idea in the biblical text of who is my neighbor, famously brought to, I think, a lot of people through the story that Jesus brings, who is my neighbor. And but I think that is
it's interesting too, even that it was a question in those days too. Who specifically is my neighbor?
So
go ahead.
No, go ahead. I'm going to pull something up.
You pull that up. Okay, so I'll just read this note that I've made, and people can debate this and shoot it down if they like. Neighbor, each of the 10 words has a corresponding blessing and curse. The commandment against adultery and coveting consistently apply to prohibitions against infringing upon one's neighbor in each category. However, and this is in reference to the Moses Scroll, however, the commandments concerning brother, theft, false witness, and hating in one's heart begin with brother in the commandment, yet in the blessing and the curse is interchanged with neighbor and associate, as we were just discussing, depending on the context. Interestingly, the Hebrew word translated here as neighbor has a broader meaning and is demonstrated in the commandment against adultery, while in English, neighbor most often applies to someone who lives next door or in the general vicinity. This is only part of the definition in Hebrew. Rehaha can refer to a relative, a comrade, a companion, a friend, or a fellow neighbor, as in a next door neighbor. Basically, it is someone with whom you are close to, either by proximity, blood, or companionship. Proximity, blood, or companionship. In the corresponding curse to the prohibition against adultery, the text reads, "Cursed is the man who draws near to any close relative, or who commits adultery with his neighbor's woman, or who lies with an animal." And as I mentioned before, in Job 30, verse 29, Job says, "I have become a brother to jackals and a companion of ostriches." Just to give an example of the broader use of the term. Companion is the word neighbor. The use of neighbor in the corresponding curse concerning theft is more likely specific to a next door neighbor, as moving a boundary stone in one's favor of adjoining land is theft. Ross.
Let me broaden this definition. We tend to think of neighbor in the terms that, narrow sense. But let me just say that Exodus, even in Exodus chapter 3 and verse 22, listen to this. Each woman shall borrow from her neighbor, and the lodger in her house objects of objects of silver and gold and clothing. You shall put these on your sons and daughters, thus stripping the Egyptians. So the idea is that neighbor is not necessarily a fellow Jew, whereas I think Miriam's point was that the word brother would indicate an Israelite and not in a broader sense. But Exodus 3:22, Exodus 11:2, both of those claim that it's a very broad understanding when you talk about neighbor. And that, again, when you get to Leviticus 19, you get 19 where let me look at these verses real quickly, 15 through 18, about, loving your neighbor and so forth. You might think of that sort of narrowly until you get to verse 33 and 34, which opens that definition up to a very wide group. So,
Quite right. No,
yeah.
that's good. Dave said, "I choose not to bear false witness against anyone unless my wife says, 'Do I look fat in this?'" And of course, that's true of every husband. That is just a universal law akin to gravity and the like,
Yeah,
and
I think,
studied by physicists around the world.
yeah,
That if your wife says, "Do I look fat in this?" Of course, even if she looks enormous, we must always say, "You look beautiful."
my daughters, one time when they were young, let's see if I can say this. One of them said, "Do these jeans make my back end look big?" And the answer that my other daughter gave her was, "No, but your back end makes those jeans look small." And I'm not sure that was any better than. Okay. So I tell you, I would say that generally speaking, the command is to not testify falsely. That's the main thing. God hates that. It's like a club, it's like an arrow. Speak truth. And then you could wrestle with the semantics of, does re'echa mean your neighbor or your fellow or but whatever it means, it can be translated and thought of in a narrow sense or a broad sense. And I think that, according, like Patty would say, my goal would be to not bear false witness against anyone. And that seems to be the idea here, is to be truthful, to be honest, and to not testify falsely against another. What else, Jono? What are you thinking?
Well, I'm just playing devil's advocate here for a second, because Miriam asks, "Is there anyone who is not a neighbor?" And sometimes there would be, I think, an argument to be made where a false witness is justified, particularly if one is not, as I said, close or associated in any way via proximity, blood, or companionship. And it reminds me of, let's go to the town of Eli. Is it the town of Eli where David says, "Hey, can you help me and my men out?" To the priest there. What was his name? I forget his name. And
Trying to follow where you're at in the story. So,
and he helps them out. And then when
Abimelech.
Saul comes and says, "Hey, listen, did you help out? That I'm against David is my enemy. You better not." And he gives a testimony of deceit. Of
Mm-hmm.
course, it costs all the priests' lives. That didn't really work out, so maybe this is not a good example. But
Yeah.
I'm sure an argument can be made in any case, but certainly not when it comes to someone with whom you have some sort of a close relationship with.
So
Uh,
Lana says the Israelites had clear instructions who couldn't be their literal neighbor, which group needed to be out of the land, i.e., Hittites, Jebusites, and so forth. But I
mm,
think even in dealing with opponents and enemies,
mm,
I don't know. I don't know that there are cases where, and maybe I'm just not thinking deeply enough. Maybe I need to give this some thought, where God would say, "Yeah, testify falsely against that person." Um,
well, if you have an enemy and that enemy is a threat, and you cannot you cannot deceive someone, well, there's no chance of an ambush. And I know there's plenty of ambushes in the Tanakh. Uh,
ambush again. I'm not talking about military strategy as much as I'm
okay.
saying when would it be appropriate for someone to lie about someone else? And maybe there are examples in the biblical text. I can think of hypotheticals where, well,
Hmm.
maybe this, maybe that, but I'm wondering if there are examples where this specific case, I can even think of a story where there is a lying spirit that is sent forth.
Hmm.
So you could get into
Oh
some of
yeah,
that maybe, but
yeah, yeah. Um, I am. Yeah, I'm just off the top of my head. I know there's a case where did such and such go? Oh, they went that way, and they were sent off in the wrong direction, so that to protect an individual. I can't remember the.
that's
Anyway,
all.
I'm sure our viewers. What's Ross? Oh, Ross has got not Ross. Dave's got the 1 Samuel 21:24.
Yeah.
Um, that's a good example. Hmm.
It's an interesting study, and when you think about the slight differences between the two, let me, in fact, before we cut off of here, I wanted to look at. There was one other text, I believe, where we talked about the different words used for lying and false. And let me see if I can find that.
So
I'm not.
Lee brings up the example. Corrie ten Boom's father would not lie and said that Jews were hiding under the table, and a Jew would have lied. I absolutely would have lied,
Yeah.
so that's a good example. So to a Jew, I wouldn't categorize the Nazi regime in any way as a neighbor under any circumstances, and by all means, um, they should be deceived at any given chance. I would absolutely advocate for that. I don't think that there is anything wrong. I think that's a good example. I don't think anyone.
Peggy's got a good example too,
Go ahead.
where she mentions that's what the
Oh,
spies,
that's right. Spies
you
of
know,
Rahab. Yeah.
Rahab covered for at Jericho. Now, again, we're kind of mixing things a little bit. I think maybe it's subtle. So I think that lying or telling something that's not true, and this I think is a little bit more specific. A lying witness,
Hmm.
Ed Shecker. It might be slightly different than saving someone's life for, I mean, the examples are good examples when
Mm.
truth is not necessarily. Dave Tyler had one, if your wife asks this question, if you're hiding someone who is going to be killed, those examples clearly. But I also think that we have to think about, what is this actually talking about?
Mm.
And I
I
did.
think if
Yeah.
one's intent is malicious towards you, then I don't think that there's a problem in in deceiving them.
Yeah.
I I don't. But as we mentioned, yeah, not so when it comes to someone who was close to you, even as far as an associate, a work associate, or um, a companion, or someone, a relative, or something like that.
Now,
Uh,
let me
yeah.
ask you this. So we jumped ahead last week. We came back and picked this up this week. I'm looking now. Let me make sure, because I've messed this up before. What is next week? What are we doing, Jono? Let me open this up and make
What are
sure.
we doing next week?
Okay. We did no coveting. Now, there are two versions of the 10 words that we have that have
a 10th
a
commandment.
a 10th
That's right.
commandment.
The Samaritan Pentateuch
That's
and
right. And
the Moses Scroll.
the Moses Scroll.
We got to do
Now,
those.
I think we could do both of them, but why don't we really focus on Shapiro next week, because in a way it springs off of this discussion we're having now. Miriam says that you can hate an enemy. The Psalms say you can hate an enemy. But one thing that Shapiro's text has is a quote that's from Leviticus, or Leviticus 19 also has it. It's about, you shall not hate your brother in your heart. So why don't we do this, Jono? Why don't next week, Thursday at 8 p.m., we talk about hate in the heart.
Yep.
And
that's
this
what
is
we'll do.
the only ancient version that has this listed as one of the 10 words. And I think it's original.
So this is good, and I think so too. So this is what we'll do. We'll do that one, and are we going to dedicate another program to the Samaritan Pentateuch's 10th commandment?
We could, or maybe we could just touch on it at the
Let's
end.
just mention it next week, and then we'll
Because
brush
it's,
over it.
by the way, it's, look, not to spoil
Because it's
it, but
different.
it's
It's an entirely different commandment altogether.
But Jono,
Yeah, it doesn't.
it's not real. It's not. I mean, it's not real.
It's not a thing.
No,
But we can talk about that briefly. And just before we go, I just want to say, yeah, Peggy's got another good example, and this did occur to me. Yael, she deceived, what was his name, Peggy, into her tent and gave him milk and tucked him into bed and tucked him into bed and gave him a bottle and then put a tent peg through his skull.
Yeah.
Oh, what was his name again? It's on the tip of my tongue.
Oh, come on, Jono. What is? I ain't have a Bible up.
I forget how it's pronounced, but Yael puts a tent peg through. Who's the first to
Lynn
get this?
says Cicero. It's close. It's close.
Cicero,
yeah.
Cicero.
That's
All
right.
right.
Good Bible
Mr.
trivia.
Karen.
My mind wasn't even there.
Peggy got there too.
Yeah.
He was a general, that's right. But absolutely
put him to bed,
deceived.
put the stake in his head. That's right.
I'm sure there's lots of examples. All right.
So next week, we're going to do a class. So we're going to do a discussion with input from our beautiful listeners here, our viewers, on hating in the heart, the 10th word of Shapiro's manuscript. And if we have time, we'll get into the Samaritan Pentateuch on their 10th. But I want people to know that the Exodus and Deuteronomy versions do not have 10 words. Go
Just got
count them.
9.
Yeah, it depends on depending on person's or religious orientation, Jewish or Lutheran or Catholic, they split either the beginning or the end to make it 10. But there's not 10 in those. You have to use either the Samaritan, and that's why the Samaritan Pentateuch has the 10th in theirs. Because obviously they only had 9.
Points to them for going, hang on, we need another one here.
That's right.
Okay. And but in any case, all right, that's what we're going to do. The 10th commandment next week, this time next week. So, dear viewers, thanks for tuning in.
Hey, look,
to Romper Room. Hey?
Jono, yeah, this was kind of a Romper Room one to start with. Saturday, I am going to tell you a little bit about the classes coming up.
Go on.
It's going to be a little bit controversial.
Ooh.
Yeah.
Of what, like, because the other ones aren't?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. But this one's going to get into, it shouldn't be controversial at all. Okay. But it has to do with the authors of the Pentateuch. The authors. You know what a ghostwriter is?
I do know what a ghostwriter is.
A ghostwriter is someone who writes but doesn't get credit.
And as opposed to the story that we get in the book of Daniel, where a hand actually comes and writes on the wall.
Right.
could argue that's a ghostwriter
it's a
as
different
well.
story, but I see the connecting point.
But
So,
someone who writes for somebody else and they take the credit, yeah.
yeah, so I'm thinking that, even though it says nowhere, now this is controversial. People that are fundamentalists don't like this, but I'm going to use the text and we're going to give credit where credit is due, and we're going to show who the authors are. And this is going to be fun. So, not going to give away the title or anything like that, but I promise you, Saturday, 10:30 a.m. Central, you got to be there. I
All
mean,
right.
unless you live in Australia and the time zone is really crazy, then you can do it later.
It's your time zone's crazy. Before we go, this is great, Dave. In Romper Room, the hostess would also serve cookies and milk to the children, and before eating, they would recite the celebrated Romper Room grace, which was, "God is great, God is good. Let us thank Him for our food." I remember that. That's great.
Now,
That's
I
so.
knew
It
that
really
prayer.
takes me back. Good stuff, Dave. That's great. I love Romper Room.
There you go. Hey,
All right,
look,
close meals.
it's been fun. It's been nice. Seth and I
Next week.
still have work to do. I'll look into what kind of mess up I did this week. I promise I'll get better. But I think I had a scheduling conflict that I produced myself. So, hey,
No worries.
guys, next week, have a great one. And don't miss Saturday morning, 10:30 a.m. And if you haven't signed up yet on the Tanakh Tour, do that too.
Done.
All right, man.
See ya.